the fall of Jerusalem, the Babylonian conquest. The destruction of the first temple of Israel was one of the most calamitous events ever to befall the Jewish people. The very symbol of their covenant relationship with the one true God, reduced to ash by a foreign king. But how could God allow his chosen people to fail to defend the house that he had built? But it turns out the answer had already been written centuries before. Long before the first stone of the temple fell, before the first exile was marched into the desert in chains, and before the fires consumed the Temple of Solomon, it had already been written. Standing at the edge of the Promised Land, centuries before these events would unfold, Moses gathered the nation of Israel and spoke words that would echo across generations, words of blessing and words of warning.
If you faithfully obey the voice of the Lord your God, the Lord will set you high above all the nations of the earth. But if you will not obey, all these curses shall come upon you and overtake you.
God had chosen this people, rescued them from the darkness of Egyptian slavery, parted the sea before them, destroyed their enemies, led them through the wilderness, and placed them in a land they did not build, with vineyards they did not plant. He had loved them and asked only for obedience to his holy word in return. But the chosen people chose not to keep the promise they had made on Mount Sinai. They did not love the Lord, their God, with all their heart, soul, mind, and strength. They bowed down and worshipped other gods, gods made of gold, of wood, and of men. This decision would split the country in two, and ultimately the divided kingdom would fall to a pair of foreign powers that God used to judge his people, invoking the curses of Deuteronomy, spoken by Moses. The story began with a people who became one nation, but ended with a kingdom torn in two, besieged by their enemies and led away in captivity. Part 1. The dividing of God's holy land. The split of the two kingdoms of Israel was never part of God's plan or design. From the covenant with Abraham in Genesis 12 to the prophecy over Judah in Genesis 49, the promise was clear: a unified people, a promised land, and a king whose scepter would endure forever. That promise would find its fulfillment not in a palace, but in a pasture. A young shepherd from Bethlehem, overlooked by his own father, chosen by God. David would take 12 scattered tribes and forge them into a kingdom, one people, one land, one throne. The very fulfillment of everything God had spoken to Abraham centuries before. What took centuries to build would take only 2 generations to destroy. Following David's death, his son Solomon ascended the throne and made a request that pleased the heart of God: not wealth, not power, but wisdom. God answered generously, pouring out upon Solomon unmatched wisdom, extraordinary wealth, and a kingdom whose splendor the ancient world had never seen. But prosperity has a way of making men forget their God. In his latter years, Solomon's heart began to drift. Drawn away by his foreign wives and their foreign gods, the man who had built the very temple of the Lord would bow before the altars of Chemosh and Molech. The wisest man who ever lived made the most foolish trade in Israel's history. He traded the God of his fathers for the idols of foreigners. David's kingdom had reached its peak under Solomon, but it would not survive his compromise. God had already determined that the scepter would be torn from Solomon's line, not entirely for the sake of his servant David, but the unified kingdom that Abraham, Moses, and David had given their lives to build was living on borrowed time. God decreed that the consequences of Solomon's sin would fall on the kingdom he left behind. Solomon's sons would succeed him, but on 2 separate thrones as the land was divided. Jeroboam would rise to claim the 10 tribes of the north. Rehoboam would be left with only 2 tribes in the south and the land of Judah and the holy city of Jerusalem. The kingdom that God had built through the faithfulness of one generation was torn apart by the unfaithfulness of the next. and the tear would never be sewn together again. End of part 1.